Welcome back to, this is part 2 of Walls of Flame, based on a book by Gerard Schultz, published in 1968. As I said in the part 1, if anybody, I believe this is in the public domain, if anybody objects to it being here and can show that they have copyright to this, please let me know and I will withdraw the videos post-haste. As we continue, area and nature of the fire. The area of the fires extended from Clare, Isabella, and Gratiot counties to Lake Huron. Fires were also burning north of Bay City and as far south as Genesee, Lapeer, and St. Clair counties. Going from west to east, the fires became worse and worse. In eastern Tuscola County, northern Sanilac County, and in eastern Huron County, the fire really became horrible and devastating. Roderick Parks writes that from Bad Axe eastward, the onrushing flames would leap high into the air, then descend to the ground like a bouncing ball, burn everything before them, and then rise for another leap. Under the arch made by the leaping flames, the area was unscathed. Thus, many buildings in the path of the fire were not burned. Where they struck, there was utter destruction. Farming implements had every particle of wood burned off. Handles were burned from the plows left in the furrows. All that was found of wooden harrows was the iron teeth. Any tree or house struck by the descending flames withered into nothingness, and this destruction went on until stopped by the waters of Lake Huron. The Michigan Department of Conservation explained this phenomenon of leaping flames as follows. Any fire of major proportions creates its own draft. That is, it must suck in huge quantities of oxygen to continue its force. This explains the situation and accounts for the fact that the fire actually traveled for long distances in the air, leaving large unburned areas before it would settle to the ground again to gather new and greater force. Sergeant William O'Bailey presents this picture of the horrible fury of the storm of fire and wind. He said, The heat from the flames was so intense that the people felt it while the fires were miles away, and sailors at Forestville felt it uncomfortably, even though the hot air had moved over the cold waters of Lake Huron a distance of 7 miles. It withered the leaves of trees 2 miles from its path. Whole fields of corn, potatoes, onions, and other growing vegetables that were not touched by the flames were nonetheless roasted by the heat. Peach, apple, and other fruit trees burst forth in blossoms. Fish in the streams were killed by the fierce heat, and after the fires were over, their dead bodies were found floating on the surface of the water. Birds escaping from these terrible flames were carried far out into the lake, and dazed and blinded, and finding no resting place, they were drowned. Several witnesses gave an account of a curious phenomenon illustrating the intensity of the heat. A peculiar blue-white flame would sometimes burst forth from ignited tree stumps, flicker a few seconds, and then the strong winds would suddenly extinguish it. It resembled a lighted candle. Sergeant Bailey says, oxygen and carbon will ignite at a temperature of 400 degrees centigrade, and as the old tree stumps were badly charred by the fires of 1871, they were essentially carbonaceous substance. The air was highly charged with gases, and with the temperature raised to 400 degrees or over, the causes of the phenomenon can, I think, be traced to these conditions. The phenomenon attracted attention in several places. Even the earth sometimes took fire. J.B. Hubble spent 2 days visiting the county about Port Hope, Sand Beach, and Minden. At the later place, he wrote a letter dated October 9, 1881, to Reverend H.C. Riggs, Secretary of the Red Cross Society at Rochester, New York, saying that men and women, cattle and horses, burned to death in open fields hundreds of feet from the actual fire. Along the Huron shore. Late Monday afternoon, the fire was coming nearer and nearer to Sand Beach with the speed of a good horse. When everything appeared hopeless, an easterly wind sprang up from the lake and saved the village from total destruction. A number of people in the vicinity of Sand Beach found safety by getting into their wells, while others died in them. Relief parties were organized to search for the living and for the dead. And among the dead, a number of bodies were burned beyond recognition. Hundreds of cattle, sheep, and hogs lay dead along the roads, while some still alive were crawling along with their feet burned off. A few people who came to Sand Beach for safety were so frightened by the terrifying fire that they refused to go back to their farms and instead boarded steamers for Detroit. The same week, however, a covered wagon from Missouri rumbled through the town of Lapeer. When the Missourian was asked where he and his family were going, he answered that they were headed for Sanilac County. At Grindstone City, every barrel, tub, and pail was filled with water from the lake. Fires near the village were still burning on Tuesday night, and about midnight they lighted the heavens so that many thought sure that the world was on fire. Two schooners, the Trojan and the Wilcox, were lying at wharf ready to assist the townspeople to make their escape in the event the fire would sweep into the town, which it did not. At Grindstone City, Charles Hempstead married earlier than planned because his bride's home was destroyed by the fire. With her consent, they sought the home of a minister living midway between Grindstone City and Huron City. On the way to the minister's home, Hempstead had to run the horses through fire which scorched the bride's scarf and dress. A black, ugly-looking cloud appeared at Huron City, with detached fragments whirling about its center. Here the fire became literally a whirlwind of fire and raced through the whole length of the settlement. From Huron City, the fire raced on in the direction of Port Hope. The propeller, City of Concord, and the schooner Lamb were at Port Hope when the fire ran through the village. The schooner Lamb caught fire, and the City of Concord towed her out into the lake where the fire was extinguished. The propeller brought a number of residents of Port Hope to Port Huron. Captain Heber of the propeller stated that the shore from Port Austin to Port Sanilac was one sheet of flames. At Port Hope, W.R. Stafford's mill and dock, together with over 500,000 feet of lumber, 200 tons of hay, and 3,000 barrels of salt were destroyed by the fire. Port Austin on Saginaw Bay was threatened by the fire, but it was saved by a strong wind blowing from the north. Just southeast of Port Austin, the fire burned up to the shore of Lake Huron. In the afternoon of September 5th, the fire suddenly roared towards the Point Barques life-saving station near Huron City with frightful energy which seemed to portend the total destruction of everything in its path. The stout-hearted keeper at once rallied his men to fight the flames. All hands sprang to action. The old surf boat was launched, and the new one placed on the pier, ready for launching. Everything in the nature of a vessel was filled with water, including 2 pork barrels and 2 buckets set on the roof of the station. The boat wagon, oil, tools, spare oars, and all apparatus and appliances were hurriedly removed to the house and put down near the lake, as far as possible from the conflagration, and the station powder was also moved to a place of safety. As the lighthouse nearby, about 300 yards distant, was by this time in great danger, the keeper dispatched 5 of his men to help Mr. Shaw, the lighthouse keeper, to fight the fire, which they did successfully. Meanwhile, the fire was raging around Mr. Shaw's farm, a mile northwest of the station, and all the buildings upon it, including 3 barns, were in flames. Indeed, the whole beach and all the woods in that direction were in conflagration, and the black smoke rolled down in a universal cloud, scarcely pierced by the red whiffs of awful flame. The keeper, knowing that Mr. Pethers and his family were up at the Shaw farm in the heart of this dreadful scene, grew fearful for their safety, and bravely resolved to go at once to their rescue. It was about 5 in the evening, and as it was impossible to travel along the blazing beach, the woods in that region growing near the water's edge, the keeper and his men launched the surf boat and pulled with all their vigor to the farm. They found Mr. Pethers and his wife and 5 children and George Shaw lying on the ground, nearly suffocated with the smoke, so far gone, in fact, that they had to be carried to the boat. But for the timely aid given them, they would have surely perished. The boat returned with them to the station, and the night was spent in watching the fire, and the danger being imminent. At 8 o'clock in the evening, the conflagration came again with a rush towards the station, and the crew fell to fighting it with all their energy. The surf boats were launched, the hawsers, hauling lines, and all cordage submerged in the lake, and everything combustible was taken away from the station to the water's edge. The house was, of course, kept drenched with water. It was a terrible night. Everything around the gallant outpost was swathed in smoke and flame. The efforts of the men continued until daybreak. By the morning of September 7th, the station house seemed to be out of danger, all around being black char, but the whole county country beyond was still on fire. At Richmondville, strange balls of fire began to fall at 4 o'clock in the afternoon of Monday, September 5th. The first one observed by Murray, who was mentioned earlier, was not larger than a hen's egg. A neighbor extinguished it, but a moment later a larger one fell near his store, which he extinguished by stamping upon it. The glowing mass appeared to be a vegetable substance like charcoal or rotten punk. This was but the harbinger of destruction, for by the time he had extinguished it, other glowing balls were falling all around him, looking like meteors as they flashed through the inky sky. As the balls of fire struck the ground, some of them would burst into countless fragments, while others would bound and roll a short distance. But no matter whether they burst or not, immediately tongues of flames would leap from the parched earth, casting a lurid glow over the scene that was terrible to the sight. 5 minutes, and the village was in flames at every point. The villagers fled to Lake Huron for safety. Some took refuge below a grove of trees, lying prone on the wet sand. They suffered intensely from the heat, smoke, and falling ashes. Others were more fortunate because they went to the water's edge at the foot of the high bank. All buildings in Richmondville were destroyed by the fire, with the exception of a frame hotel and a deserted house which had become a rookery. Late Tuesday morning, F. Murray and George Allen started for Forester, where a burnt tract extended about 6 miles from the lake front and ran inland for 4 to 6 miles. In this area, only 15 buildings out of more than 300 escaped the fire. Murray reported that on this tract there lay still smoking the carcasses of 500 head of cattle, horses, and sheep. The stench from these was intolerable, and 50 men were put to burying them. Although roasted, the bodies were in such an advanced stage of decomposition that they would fall to pieces, and a scraper was brought in to requisition to move them to the trenches. Many people living near the shore ran into Lake Huron to escape the fire. Some were suffocated by smoke while standing in the lake. The cinders falling into the water made a lie, so that it was necessary to go down several feet under the surface to get drinking water. One man who jumped for safety into the lake during the night found himself standing directly behind a bear the next morning. Places inland. More houses and buildings were burned at Bad Axe than in any other towns, although a few smaller villages were completely destroyed. Bad Axe was surrounded by windfalls and slashings. Monday afternoon, the entire atmosphere appeared to be aflame. Firebrands from the windfalls and slashings were dropping here and there. It seemed but a few minutes from the time everybody was busy in their shops and offices until almost the whole village was in flames. The main path of the fire swept through the blocks directly north of Huron Avenue, destroying all the houses and other buildings in the town except a few to the north and to the south. People ran to the new brick courthouse with its tile roof for safety. Men pumped water from the wells and drenched the courthouse with it. Two things were in their favor. The well was on the east side of the courthouse, which provided some protection from the wind, and the supply of water was plentiful. It was so hot that the men could stand this work for only a few minutes. Then a new crew took over. When the fire across the street reached a hardware store with kegs of gunpowder and 30 barrels of kerosene, everybody ran inside the courthouse. That night, some 400 people slept on the floors of the courthouse. When at 7 o'clock the next morning, Charles E. Thompson looked at the thermometer in the building, the temperature was 110 degrees. Dr. John Wesley Brown, who was 5 years old at the time of the fire, was one of those who found safety at the courthouse. Later in life, he remembered that when he put his hand to the window, it got burned because the heat from the high fire was so intense. Some of the people of Bad Axe fled to an open space east of the village. Here they dug a trench into which they put the women and children. The trench was then covered with rails, and then wet blankets were put over the rails. John Ballantyne of Verona informed the press that on Monday forenoon there was no fire within 8 miles of his place. About 1 o'clock that afternoon of that day, a wind came up from the west that was almost a hurricane, and in an instant the air seemed to be filled with fire. Ballantyne owned a sawmill, gristmill, store, and other property. He took great care to protect his property from fire, wetting everything down around the mill with a hose twice a day. When the fire approached from the west, it leaped from one point to another, and its coming was so sudden that no one thought of saving property and sought protection for life alone. Ballantyne and his family ran to a field and remained there from about 1 o'clock in the afternoon until 3 o'clock the next morning. The smoke was so thick that they nearly suffocated and were unable to see anything. Dewbills belonging to Ben McKillen, blacksmith at Verona, were picked up by the wind and carried them across Lake Huron to Canada, where they fell to the ground. At the time of the Michigan Forest Fire anniversary in 1946, Millicent Meskey of Muskegon, Michigan, wrote that at Verona Mills in Huron County, my mother, then a little girl 3 years old, was put under blankets in a plowed field with her brothers and sisters. The blankets were kept wet with pails of water from the well. Her family lost everything in the fire: home, barns, grains, livestock, supplies, clothing. The only thing my grandmother saved was a walnut bed which she threw in the well. The family was left without any means of transportation, and there were no stores left where they could buy supplies and clothing. I remember my grandmother telling about the barrels of clothing and food which the Red Cross immediately sent into Michigan. These were distributed through whatever churches were left standing, and also at the courthouse in Bad Axe. Millicent Meskey's father recalled the fire vividly. In a letter written about 1946, he stated, "Your grandparents lived on a farm 2.5 miles north of Melvin in Sanilac County. About 10 of the neighbors were helping your grandfather thresh grain on September 5, 1881, and the neighbor women were helping your grandmother prepare the noon meal. Smoke had been dense all morning, and the women had lighted kerosene lamps in the house toward noon. The wind suddenly became strong. I climbed up a ladder to the barn roof and saw fire rolling across the fields nearly a mile away. Fences were burning. I called out. Men rushed the threshing machines out of the barn, began tearing down fences and putting pails of water on the roofs of the buildings. The neighbors could not go home to their own farms as we were entirely surrounded by fire. Although firebrands fell on the roof many times, all our buildings were saved and were the only ones left standing for miles around. Your grandmother sent the children into the orchard. Fruit and leaves were burned off the trees, and firebrands fell on us. Smoke was so dense that we could not see. We buried our faces in the dirt in order to breathe. People were sick for days afterwards from the smoke. Many had sore eyes. Those were saved did so by staying in the plowed fields and near the wells. The fire was at its worst in Paris Township in Huron County. Thomas Thompson of White Rock, which was not destroyed by the fire, gave this tragic account of the destruction of his township. After keeping watch 48 hours incessantly without sleep, the wind changed to the north and cleared up the smoke, and I then got a rig and, taking along some provisions, started west and made for the township of Paris, and through that part of it suffered the most. It is almost impossible to describe to you the ravages the fire had made in this township. I traveled miles where every farmer is burned out. I went 4 miles on one road, and every building, fence, and almost every herd of stock are destroyed. 15 lives were lost along this stretch of road. He met a wagon drawn by an oxen. On the wagon were 3 rough boxes filled with 8 corpses. A man walking behind was the only mourner, following his wife and children to the grave, they having been burned to death. A little farther on, he found another woman and 5 children who had burned to death in the middle of the road. After the fire, 28 families lived in 4 houses in Paris Township. West of Port Hope, a man walking along the road carried all that remained of his beloved wife and child in a 3-quart tin pail. All that was left of the mother was a small piece of the backbone. He went to the spot where he saw them alive, and there found the charred remains. Mr. and Mrs. James McCulley lived on their farm near Deckerville when the fire swept over Sanilac County. They took refuge in the potato patch and saved their lives by lying down and burying in the sand. Though they kept throwing sand upon themselves, Mrs. McCulley was severely burned for months, lost her voice. Their neighbor's daughter, Sarah Sharkey, 16 years old, ran from her home to the McCulley's home. During her flight, she inhaled so much smoke and was so frightened that it caused her death. She died in Mr. McCulley's arms, and the tragedy of it was that the Sharkey home did not burn. A man in Sanilac County fought the fire. One of his arms was nearly burned off. He returned to his home, where his 2 small children were nearly suffocated, and realizing that he could not save both of them, had to choose which one to carry off with the arm he had left. He hesitated in bewilderment for a moment, and then, as the flames were already blistering him, picked up the older child and escaped, while the younger one burned to a crisp. George Denio of Waterton Township in Sanilac County saved the lives of his wife and children by taking them to a sandbank. After he had supplied himself with a tub of water and a dipper, he covered his family with a large piece of carpet, and then poured water on the carpet, which caught fire 3 times. Twice he fell down from heat exhaustion, but each time he roused himself. All the members of his neighbor's family burned to death. Dennis O'Connell of his family lived 2 miles south of Ubly. When the tornado of flames came near his place on Monday afternoon, his entire family, consisting of himself, wife, and 8 children, went into a well which was about 12 feet deep, with 2 or 3 feet of water at the bottom. 3 members of a neighbor's family joined them, cramped in the narrow space, shrouded in utter darkness, nearly suffocated with smoke, and being utterly helpless for the time being. 13 persons, including 1 infant in its mother's arms, remained from 2 until 7 o'clock before they dared venture out into the upper world again. The fires around Cass City were described as mountains of flames. On Monday, September 5th, the villagers removed their household goods to a plowed field where they spent the night. In the vicinity of Cass City, several persons burned to death and many suffered serious injuries. More than 100 victims of the fire came to the village for safety and help. It was reported that within the radius of 8 miles of Cass City, every house was burned except 1. According to the local newspaper, the village was saved only by an abundant supply of water and the most heroic persuasion and persistent efforts of the citizens who fought the fire without food or sleep. Join us for part 3 when we'll continue looking at more of the inland fires in what must have been one of the most horrible chapters in Michigan's history. Thank you for stopping by.